Fire Emblem. This franchise of tactical RPG games was for a long time one of Japan's best kept secrets from the West. Slowly over the now 16 entries in the series, Fire Emblem has started to command the attention and respect it has for so long deserved. While the series has done very little to get away from its core gameplay of turn-based grid strategy combat, it has been able to refine its mechanics and gameplay outside of battles to create consistently great games. This has been doubly true in the more recent years with newer entries like Awakening, which have played a huge role in catapulting the series into a AAA heavy hitter for Nintendo. Fire Emblem Three Houses furthers this meteoric rise of the franchise, and from the look of it, it is not slowing down anytime soon.
Reach for my hand, I'll soar away into the dawn. Oh, I wish I could stay.
Three Houses' biggest strength is its ability to stay 100% faithful to the franchise while also delivering experiences fans couldn't have imagined would ever come to a Fire Emblem game. The world building is fantastic, and the tried and true Fire Emblem scenario of a continent engulfed in war is better than it has ever been. Intelligent Systems has also implemented a Persona-esque academy system that I don't think anybody was expecting. Combat, which has been the foundation of the IP, is as strong as ever, and visually the game is able to transport you onto the front lines quite literally by leveraging the capabilities of the Nintendo Switch. The soundtrack, though not large, packs a punch and is capable of evoking emotion when it needs to. And now that we've taken kind of a brief overlook at the history of Fire Emblem and how it's led us to today, let us begin our in-depth analysis of Fire Emblem Three Houses. We're going to start off today by taking a look at the story of Three Houses. Fire Emblem is a series, as I mentioned before, that has always had engaging stories, but I've always found them to take a backseat to the gameplay. Three Houses bucks that trend and goes all in on its storytelling. The story starts off with our main character, Byleth, who's a mercenary, saving three very important nobles from the main ruling factions on the continent of Fodlan. These being Edelgard von Hresvelg, the Empress-in-Waiting of the Adrestian Empire, Dmitri Alexander Bladed, the heir to the throne of the Kingdom of Fargus, and Claude von Regen, the leader of the preeminent house of the Leicester Alliance. After some convincing, Byleth's father Geralt decides on following these three youths back to Garreg Monastery, a huge religious academy for teaching the arts of war to the youth of Fodlan. The story kicks into gear as soon as you arrive at the academy. We meet Lady Rhea, the Archbishop of the academy and the leader of the faith of Seiros, which worships a mysterious goddess. As you meet all the students and faculty around the academy, multiple plotlines start unfolding that are quite gripping. To be honest, I expected a game that was full of anime tropes and story elements, but to my surprise I found that the game did a very good job of keeping me on my toes and not knowing what to expect. There's a pretty big character reveal in part 1 that I can honestly say I did not see coming at all. The overarching plot of the game diverges and takes different paths depending on which house you choose to side with as a professor at the academy. I really think this method of splitting the game into 3 different paths, well, technically 4 different paths, is worth having a deeper conversation about. The majority of the story in part 1 of Three Houses is essentially the same no matter which house you choose. It's after the 5-year time skip that the different paths diverge in meaningful ways. This is a great asset to Three Houses, but can also be a slight detriment at times. These different routes you take on your journey are separate scenarios with drastically different circumstances. Each of the Three House leaders have very different goals for the continent, and the situations, locations, and enemies vary throughout each path. There are quite a few positives to this approach of storytelling. Essentially, with Fire Emblem Three Houses, we are getting 3 full games packed into one $60 purchase. With Fire Emblem Fates, they created different versions of the game, and buying them all cost quite a bit, especially for a Nintendo 3DS game. On top of this, there are other games like Pokemon that sell two different versions of essentially the same game, both at full price, knowing that some people really can't help themselves from buying both. I want to commend Intelligent Systems for taking the high road on this one and truly giving us an incredible amount of content. On my first playthrough, I was at about 55 hours when I beat it, and the first thing I did was go right back to the New Game Plus screen and start another path. It is just that good. But let's get back on track, as that was somewhat of a tangential side note. Another huge benefit of the way this game is structured into 3 factions is the fact that you truly feel like you are getting to know the members of each house closely. Instead of trying to jam all the character development into one playthrough, they are able to compartmentalize here and create a connection with the members of a specific faction. Since they have ditched the in-depth romance system from previous games, more focus was put into defining unique characters for who they are, instead of making them feel like cookie-cutter, stereotypical romantic interests. Sure, some of the characters like Caspar can feel ripped like straight out of an anime at times, but then there are characters like Petra with her quirky grammar who truly do feel unique. But even further, other characters like Sylvain or Lysithea have incredible depth to them after you become closer. Obviously, great care was taken in developing the leaders of the 3 houses. In particular, I find Edelgard and Dimitri extremely intriguing, and I love the way they play off each other no matter which route of the story you are in. I mentioned before that there is a slight detriment to the way the game is made, and the only real downfall that I want to highlight here is that when you are going through a single playthrough, after you finish that path, there are definitely some huge question marks at the end. This wouldn't be too terribly frustrating if the playthroughs of the game were a teensy bit shorter. As I previously stated, each of the playthroughs is 50 hours plus, so having to play every single path to get the full picture of the continent is a steep asking price. Even though the asking price is so steep, I think it's a great storytelling method for this game specifically. In war, information is limited. Both sides believe that they are right and cannot waver in their beliefs and ideals. The fact that each path stays focused on your house's plight actually works magnificently. While on the single path, you learn a focused amount of information and lore, and you start to see how every side of the war has some sort of valid reasoning, and it makes sure that nothing is black and white in this game. While there is no canon ending to the game, after going through the different paths and putting all the information together for yourself, you can decide who you believe to have the most just cause and where your allegiances truly belong. This is something that I had not expected from a Fire Emblem game, which usually resorts to a more generic, clear-cut storytelling of the main character leading the good guys. Another reason 3 Houses is so successful and works as good as it does is the way in which the story is delivered. Obviously, there are the standard cutscenes that appear before and after battles to cover the significant plot points, but it is the information that is fed through other means that really make a difference. Conversations with students and NPCs throughout the monastery on free days fill in a lot of the background information that neither Byleth nor the player would be familiar with. In these moments, we are given insight on how all of our units feel about the current events. In Part 1, these are normally just light-hearted comments, but in Part 2, a lot of these brief conversations can be extremely deep. They range from questions of resolves and ideals or reservations about fighting and killing former friends and allies. Yes, this game doesn't beat around the bush and sugarcoat things. Some allies grow weary of the war and are reluctant to go into battle. This is a far cry from the former games where it feels as if everybody is gun-ho and ready to fight no matter who the opponent is. 3 Houses takes a closer look at the effects of war on a personal level, and it is all the better for it. This is further reinforced by support conversations. These longer conversations between Byleth and his students, or between two students, enhance the experience in multiple ways. Firstly, they develop the relationships between characters and make you care about almost each and every unit. This puts you into Byleth's shoes, and you want to make sure that every single one of your units comes out alive when playing on Classic mode, as permadeath ensures that when you lose a unit, you lose the relationships and all the time you invested into them. Secondly, it focuses the story more on characters and each of their personal goals and aspirations. I'm a firm believer that a character-driven story is much more appealing than a story that focuses on the grand scheme. It's human nature to care more about a particular person that we know than a faction or a faceless soldier in a war. As a bonus, some of these support conversations can lead to pretty massive story revelations or paralogue battles, all of which feel very organically delivered. Overall, I think Three Houses does story right at both the big picture level and at the smaller scale character level. This truly does set a new bar for the franchise. I alluded to this earlier in the analysis, but Three Houses can be broken down into two different categories gameplay-wise. Naturally, combat plays a huge role in this game, but what makes it stand out so much is what happens outside of combat. The combined structure here is something we've never seen before in a Fire Emblem game. Byleth and his students are given a mission each month, and in the weeks leading up to this mission, the player is given complete freedom on how to prepare for the upcoming battle. Free days, which are on Sunday, have three major ways of spending one's time: exploring the monastery, hosting a seminar, or going into battle. Battling is self-explanatory enough. You are able to take your units out and do paralogue or auxiliary battles, which will help you level them up. And we'll get into battling more later. Let's talk about exploration, seminars, and the other mechanics that are a welcome addition. Exploring on your activity days allows Byleth to freely roam around the monastery. This is how one converses with and gets to know the many students and faculty of Garreg Mach. There are also plenty of other things Byleth can do, such as having meals with students, cooking meals to raise stats temporarily for the month, fishing, putting students in training tournaments, hosting a tea party, and singing praise to the saints. Depending on which students you perform these activities with, you can increase both their support rank and their motivation meter. The latter is particularly important because without motivation, the students cannot learn and increase their skills. Every Monday, Byleth gives personal lessons to the students. In this system, you trade your motivation points to increase your skill levels as you desire. By doing this and by setting up to 2 goals for your students, you can really mold your units into whatever you want them to be. Having a high skill level for a certain weapon type not only allows you to wield more powerful weapons, but if you meet a certain skill requirement, you can take a certification exam and gain access to much more powerful classes. The seminar option has a faculty member from the school come and teach a lesson on the subject of their expertise. Students who are interested in the subject of the class will show up and not only receive a motivation boost, but also directly receive skill points based on what is being taught. This balancing act of choosing how to spend your free day, whether it be exploring, hosting a seminar, or going to battle, is a very addictive loop and one that had me coming back for more continually. Trying to keep your units strong and motivated while also trying to recruit members from other houses truly was a test of resource management, especially early on in the game. But as you level up Byleth's professor rank and you get more activity points to spend during the day, there's a little bit more margin for error. This system of training and befriending units is often compared to the Persona series, and I don't think I can argue with that assessment. The similarities are striking. Yes, the social systems of Persona are a little deeper than what is found here in Fire Emblem. Nevertheless, the pleasure of getting to know your allies and watching them grow into powerhouses is amazing, especially knowing all the small details and micromanagement that went into their growth. Of course, all of the aforementioned mechanics that were implemented would mean nothing if the gameplay wasn't up to snuff. The grid-based combat is largely unchanged and will feel extremely familiar to fans of the franchise. Still, there are a multitude of new options in battle that keep things fresh and interesting. The first of which are combat arts. A combat art allows you to perform a special ability with different properties than a regular attack, but at the cost of more weapon durability. These include things like adding crit chance on an attack, extra range on a bow shot, upgraded strength on an axe attack, etc. I personally really like the design choices behind combat arts, as it gives you extra options while still having consequences to weigh. If a unit abuses arts and their weapon breaks, you could be in big trouble. The money to repair or buy a new weapon after the battle ends is also a consideration when using combat arts. Another system that I think the game got right is the battalion system. Instead of the pairing system that has been present in the more recent titles, now you can assign a battalion to each unit depending on their authority skill. These battalions grant not only stat boosts, but also some pretty unique abilities. Battalion skills can't be countered, and AoEs like poison or immobilization can turn the tide of battle quickly. To keep battalions from being overpowered, these skills have very limited uses, and battalions have a finite amount of stamina and will flee when it is depleted. Along with a couple of new classes to the series, there is also a new enemy type. Fighting monsters is much different than fighting enemy soldiers. These units are extremely powerful, take up multiple spaces on the grid, and have multiple health bars. On top of that, they have armor that must be broken before damage can be dished out. I can honestly say fighting the various types of monsters were the best and most challenging moments in Three Houses. And now that I mentioned challenge, I do want to comment on the difficulty of this game. On my first playthrough I did classic mode with normal difficulty, and at first the game was pretty hard, but it quickly became a breeze. Even on my second playthrough on hard mode, I didn't find it that hard at all, and I know a lot of people blame the Divine Pulse system, which lets you rewind time if you make a mistake and allows you to return to a previous moment in the battle. I strongly object to this being the cause of the lower difficulty, because I only used it a couple times ever, and it was usually because I misclicked something or I misplaced a unit where I wanted them to walk because I had Joy-Con drift, something along those lines. I only mention this because a lot of die-hard fans love the high difficulty that Fire Emblem is known for. And at the time of this review, a new difficulty dubbed Maddening has been added to the game. I haven't had a chance to try out this mode, but I have a feeling people who crave a challenge will be satisfied. To sum up combat overall, it's great, and utilizing your inner tactician and systematically taking down an opposing army is as fun as it has ever been. Even though the Nintendo Switch isn't a traditional home console, Fire Emblem has never been on any system with this level of power. The series has never looked better. The art style is very reminiscent of modern anime, but in 3D. Characters have very defined features in their models. The character portraits all look fantastic, and the faces even change slightly depending on the context of the conversation, which I thought was a nice touch. The animated 2D cutscenes that play in important parts of the story are incredible, and the only complaint is that I wish there were more of them. This is especially true because the animation pool for the 3D models was fairly limited. The same animations are used in many different situations that don't always make sense. This lack of animations also translated to the battlefield. Many of the combat arts have the same exact animation despite being quite different abilities. Don't get the wrong idea though, because combat looks better than I could have hoped for. In the past, it has been hard to visualize Fire Emblem as a real war because you only saw your units fighting the other units. Now the fact that battalions are shown in combat and they fight alongside you, it truly starts to feel like you are on the battlefield. On top of that, you can control your units from the ground level and run across the battlefield freely, further establishing that this is a large-scale war. Even if you are still in the traditional grid-based, top-down view, the game looks astronomically better than anything we've seen in the series. On top of that, the monastery and all of its locations look fantastic, but you can tell that the Switch is being pushed to its limits here. Ground textures, particularly on the battlefield, are pretty poor. I do think this is easy to overlook, however, seeing how good the rest of the environments look. The only other glaring issue is that the backgrounds in many of the cutscenes are 2D drawings, and the problem isn't that they are 2D drawings, but they are extremely ugly drawings that are blurry and bland. And I do imagine if another Fire Emblem game were to come to the Switch, these two flaws would be remedied to match the high quality of presentation found elsewhere in the game. The music in Three Houses was composed by a trio of artists, Takeru Kanazaki, Hiroki Morishita, and Rei Konda. When I learned that the soundtrack was composed by a group of three, I was a little surprised. That's mostly due to the fact that the amount of tracks in this game is somewhat limited. Even though the official number of tracks is a little bit over 100, a lot of those you only hear once or you only hear in a particular path of the story. Luckily, the tracks that are heavily relied upon throughout the game are really good, and I like that the music in Part 1 and Part 2 of the game have a completely different tone. All of the pieces from Part 2 of the story were really heavy and conveyed the weight of the situation at hand and how serious it was. This is much different than the vibes given off in Part 1, which were more adventurous and curious. I thoroughly enjoyed the tunes from start to finish, and I don't really have anything negative to say about the soundtrack. Some of my favorite tracks include As Swift as Wind, Golden Deer and Crescent Moon, and lastly, Tempest of Seasons. Simply put, this is a fantastic game that, in my personal opinion, is the best the franchise has ever seen. The story and world will have you coming back for more again and again with a scary amount of replay value. The new mechanics outside of battle combined with the refined combat system and new monster enemies form an engaging experience that won't get old even after 100 hours of playtime. Whether you prefer to play games on the go in handheld mode or on your TV at home, this is an absolute must-own game for the Nintendo Switch. The game is so well-rounded and has something on offer for everybody. It allows each individual to play the game how they want to. One will be hard-pressed to find a better tactical RPG anywhere, regardless of platform. The best in the franchise, Fire Emblem Three Houses.